Where do music and mathematics meet? For Jessica Shand, at the computer. Jessica is a professional performer and composer whose work exemplifies the word interdisciplinary.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Jessica, and this talk is called Adventures in Sound and Technology. A little bit about me. I'm a flutist, producer, composer, researcher, and I actually brought one of my flutes today. This is a bass flute. So it's basically a big tube of metal. I'll be talking about a little bit more throughout the talk. But really what ties together all of the different stuff that I do is music and mathematics, and those kind of have been threads throughout my life as a student, going to MIT and beyond. But before I get too far into it, I wanted to start with a warm up. Every musician knows you have to have a good warm up. So the way this is going to work is it's like a little quiz. And the question is, who or what did the sound come from? And there are going to be 3 sound samples. So I want you to listen to each of them and write down or keep in your mind what your answer was. So here's the first one. So your options for that one are a firework exploding, birds singing, or a flute. And I'll play it one more time. All right. Here's number 2. Is that one a clock ticking, crickets chirping, or a flute? Okay, and last one, number 3. So that one, does that sound like a mosquito, crackling electricity, or a flute? And one more time. Cool. So that's your warm up for today. And how'd you do? Well, if you answered a flute to all of them, believe it or not, you are correct. And this has kind of been one of the exciting premises of some of my research and artistic work in the last couple of years at MIT. Now, the answer is actually a little bit more complicated than just a flute, because it involves a flute. There's me with my flute, but it also involves a computer. And so that's kind of where the basis of this talk as Adventures in Sound and Technology comes in. So you might be just wondering, what the heck did I just listen to? Well, let's get into it, and let's talk about sound a little bit. So what is sound? We can think about sound in terms of vibrations that we hear and or feel. And a nice way to think about this is if you put your hand on your chest while you're talking or humming, not only do you hear the sound of your voice in your ears, but you can also feel the vibration in your chest. And so sound is something that we often talk about in terms of stuff that we hear with our ears, but it's also something that's very tactile. And that's one of the things that I find very fascinating about it. It can travel in the form of a wave through the air, but it can also travel through objects. And so it's kind of natural for us nowadays to think of sound as data. If you've ever opened up the voice memos app on your phone, you can see the sound wave of your voice kind of going past while you record it. So this image might look quite familiar to you. And we can learn a lot from thinking about sound as data. We can learn things like how loud or soft it is, how high or low it is, or how short or long a sound is, by taking a look at this data. But the sort of, you know, parameter or aspect of sound that has really captivated me is this thing called timbre. So it's not exactly the question of how loud a sound is, how high a sound is, but it's actually a composite of a lot of those different qualities. And one nice way to describe timbre is in terms of the identity of the sound. So here's an example for you. So notice how all of those sounds sort of have the same rhythm, the same pitch. They're all musical instruments, but you could kind of tell there's something different about the quality of those sounds that tells you, oh, the first one sounded kind of like a trumpet, second one maybe like a piano, and the third one kind of like some string instruments. And that's really what timbre is. At the end of the day, it can be talked about in terms of a lot of computational crazy numbers and stuff like that, but also it's really an interaction between a listener and a sound and sort of the way that what we imagine when we hear a sound. So for example, with all those instruments that we heard before, um, from years of playing in an orchestra, I can recognize those instruments because I have these memories of what they're like. But all of it is sort of projected in my own imagination based off of those memories and experiences, and also certain expectations. If you've never heard those instruments before, you might not necessarily associate those sounds with those instruments or those sort of identities. And so the goal of the research that I have been doing at MIT and beyond is to explore that relationship to explore where that relationship kind of starts to break down. So when you hear something, but what the thing actually is doesn't really correspond to what you heard, or when you hear something that, you know, for example, with the mosquito example, is actually a flute. So this is sort of the premise of what I've been doing, and you might just be thinking, okay, yeah, why should I care? Why are you making weird sounds with flutes? Well, there's a lot of reasons. Um, it's really interesting to try and understand how people listen. Um, and it's also really important to challenge our assumptions about sound and identity. We can expand our imaginations and hear things that we never heard before by thinking of things in this way. And we can create really rich, beautiful sound textures, for example, for applications in video games or movies. And then we can kind of tap into some bigger questions too about art and about reality and about the nature of the world around us. And so one musician and researcher who has been a really big inspiration for this work is named Suzanne Ciani. And you might recognize a sound that she created a few decades back, which I'll play here. Yeah, so um, that is the sound of a pop and pour of a soda, which is, has been used in advertising, but it's actually a completely false reality that she has created entirely using those synthesizers that you see in those pictures. So that is not a real recording. And what she's able to do is create a really evocative, interesting sound through this technique of synthesis. Um, and so that's, just one application of all these interesting questions. So how this relates to my research and how it works, I'll just take you through one example from the warm-up. Actually, before I do that, I wanted to give you a quick analogy with my cat. So this is Bowie, and as you can see, he is sitting in a sink. And I could start, applying some filters. You can kind of still tell that that's my cat, that's Bowie. But the more that I kind of start to distort it, it's like you can still make out some of the overall shapes. But eventually, the more that I do, it's like, oh, it almost looks like a forest or a map or something else. So the more that you kind of start to process and transform things, it actually influences your perception of what they are, and then perhaps influences how you choose to continue to transform them. So how this works in this example from before, well, let's take a look. So this is the first sound that I started off with on the flute, and that's pretty subtle, so not a very typical flute sound, but something like that. And then gradually, one step at a time, kind of like applying those photo filters, getting to something that, depending on how you hear it, might resemble like a firework or an explosion or something whizzing by or a bird. Um, those are all examples of things that people actually heard when they heard those sounds. So I actually went ahead and I conducted some surveys where I was asking people at each stage of those transformations, what are you hearing? And so those were some examples. And so I find it really interesting how different people hear those sounds really differently and have different interpretations of them. So as you can tell, a big underlying theme of a lot of this work is the idea of transformation. And in the last couple of minutes of my talk, I just wanted to show you a little bit more behind the scenes of my kind of personal transformation through this journey of working and playing with sound. This is one of my wonderful mentors. I know a lot of you have amazing teachers that you adore, and this is that person for me. Her name is Claire Chase. There you can see her with her bass flute, and we're performing together. And she was the person who really taught me to start exploring different kinds of weird sounds on my instrument. Um, then when I was at MIT, I got to be a part of this awesome jazz band. You can see here, I don't know if I can use my mouse here, but you can see that I am next to Miguel Zanon, who is one of our faculty members, incredible, incredible artist and human being. And this is our group also after a show. And similarly, they just really emboldened me to try improvising in more of a jazz context, and again, just exploring different kinds of sounds. And that actually led me to create my own album out of this research. So here you can see my bedroom studio setup, and you know, a performance that I did with the flute, some recording at home. And coincidentally, that album actually came out last Friday. So it is a way of trying to take this crazy sound world that I've started to explore with the flute and turn it into a piece of music that we can listen to as just one way to kind of absorb some of this material. But a huge part of my practice also is live performance and that ritual of coming together in a concert space and encountering sounds together as a group of people. So, as a concluding remark, I just wanted to play for you an example from my master's thesis at MIT of how I am using these sounds in a live performance context. So, here it is. So if you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear them. And here's again my cat, Bowie. Please stay in touch and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jessica. That was super, super cool. And we already have some wonderful questions from Nord Anglia students in the Q&A pod. So to kick it off, Abhinav is wondering, what's the name of that song you just played?
Oh, it doesn't have a great name. It's called Study Number Two. But it's because it comes directly from my research. And so I had these 12 studies where I took a sample of myself playing the flute. The first one was actually that fireworks example. And yeah, so that was an example from the second study.
Wow, that is just really neat. And so we have another question about this transformation of sound that you've described. So Nico from Boston is wondering, can you make almost any sound with a flute? For example, could you make a flute sound like a jet engine?
Whoa. Yeah, I mean, so the cool thing is there's a lot that you can do acoustically with the flute before you even bring the computer into it, right? So if I have this here, I can just blow air into it. I can do stuff like that. There's so much of a sound palette already. But then once I bring the computer into it, the possibilities are basically infinite. So it's a great question. Yeah, you could pretty much make almost any sound.
That is really exciting. I really want to kind of hear the how far you could push it. So I'm really excited to listen to your album. We have a question from Ninika. Ninika's wondering, she first says that your cat is really cute. She wanted to let you know. And she's wondering, how did you get into flute in the first place? What was your first interaction with flute like?
Great question. Well, yes, thank you. I will let Bowie know. I'm sure he'll appreciate the compliment. But yeah, my first experience with flute. So actually, I didn't mention this, but I actually started off as a dancer. So when I was about 4 or 5, I started taking ballet classes, and I really fell in love with the music. I remember dancing in the Nutcracker, and there would be these beautiful flute solos. And so I became really interested in the idea of like joining my elementary school band. And when I was in fourth grade, again, wonderful teacher, Miss Erickson, music class. She had started this band, and they had this instrument petting zoo where you could come in for a day and try out all the different instruments. And I actually couldn't make a sound out of the flute, so I almost played the clarinet. But it took me about 1 or 2 months until I could make a sound, and I was just super stubborn and persistent that I wanted to play the flute because it was just this completely beautiful instrument that looked so challenging with all of its keys and just like a good puzzle. And so I just persisted, and that is how I started completely in school.
That is wonderful. And that kind of leads into a question from Lilia. You mentioned that, in the beginning you were trying out a bunch of instruments as part of being in band. And Lilia's wondering how long did you practice other instruments? And do you play any other instruments in addition to flute now?
Yeah. So I've been playing flute for longer than I have not been playing the flute, probably about 17 years now. And do I play other instruments? Yes. Flute is definitely the center of my musical life. Everything kind of feels like it comes out from that, but I do, like you saw me in that video playing at a keyboard, so I do sometimes use the keyboard as a nice tool for writing music. I've played guitar, I've tried singing. Um, wouldn't necessarily call myself a singer though. So yeah, I love to dabble. There's also this other instrument that's called the theremin, which is another electronic instrument that if anyone's curious to check out, definitely recommend. And during the pandemic, I bought one of those and I was playing with that one as well.
That is really cool. So as part of this journey as a musician, you do have the chance to try new things. And does that help inspire new sounds you can make as well?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, that's a great question, a great way to put it, because I think that a lot of this inspiration around transformation of sound had to do with synthesizers, which are this electronic instrument that was kind of invented for that very purpose of exploring new sounds. That's kind of exactly the kind of thing that the example that I showed from Suzanne Ciani was doing. So I was thinking a lot about basically how to use the flute as a synthesizer. And the question of can I use the flute to imitate other sounds before then trying to use the instrument to create new or weird or, kind of hard to parse sounds.
That is, I'm totally amazed. And I mean, in that example that you showed, I have heard that sound of what sounds like a can opening and then, the liquid being poured. And I had absolutely no idea that that was something that was synthesized. That is just so incredible. And I think now, kind of just talking about this process of the synthesizer and what it's doing, we have a question from Ria. And Ria's wondering, do you think music is an application of mathematics? If so, how? And does the synthesizer kind of wed those two?
Great question, Ria. So I think that I think that electronic music, so all of this music that involves recording sounds, processing sounds as data, kind of the sorts of stuff that I showed, it kind of lends itself nicely to um, thinking about mathematics because so much of it has to do with computer science and coding and equations and formulas. Um, so I think that it is a very natural correspondence, especially with, anything involving computers. You can automatically, as soon as you're turning sounds into numbers, you can imagine that there's, a natural connection to mathematics. But the connection between mathematics and music, to me, goes far beyond that. I think that on one hand, you can talk about physics and the nature of sound waves and, the way that um, different aspects of sound, if they're high or low or loud or soft, you can actually see those things in the sound waves and think about them in terms of physics. And of course, in the ancient times, all of those subjects used to be studied together. Music and arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy, they were all kind of seen as one. So I think a lot of times people think about that and talk about it that way. Another way to think about it that I really kind of connect to is the idea of truth. And I see mathematics in many ways as a search for truth. If anyone's done like geometry or started thinking about, short proofs or stuff like that, I remember doing that in my middle school class. It becomes a search for truth and for some kind of um, guarantee or certainty of an argument. And sometimes I like to think about music that way too. It's a different kind of truth, but it's playing with that truth. And especially with this application where you have these sounds that, could be entirely false realities constructed from a computer or just through perceiving sounds a certain way. You're dealing with truth in a totally different way. But to me, that's also how they connect.
I mean, that's such a neat way to put it. And I like this idea of truth, and how, this kind of stems from the mathematics and how that works. I want to keep a little bit of attention on the connection between mathematics and music for a second and ask a question from Arav from Oak Ridge. And Arav's wondering, when did you start getting interested in this idea of the technology in addition to the sound? Because you started in the fourth grade. So when did technology start coming into it? When did this truth start coming into it?
Yeah, great question. Well, I think that when I was in high school, I was really interested in science and math and always enjoyed those subjects personally. But I didn't really start thinking of them together until I got to college. And I didn't really have time anymore to think of them as separate things. Otherwise, I couldn't live two lives anymore. I had to start to think about ways that I could bring all of those interests together. And I think it was around then with my mentor Claire that I showed a picture of. And of course, during the pandemic, when we were all in lockdown, I was kind of by myself. Oftentimes, like one of my favorite parts of being a musician is getting to play with other people, but that wasn't an aspect of that time. So then I started thinking about, oh, how could I make a band just out of myself? Or how could I, add different instruments or different sounds? And I think that that's where it really started to click for me.
That is really neat. And another math related question in terms of this manipulation you're able to do. How does the timbre of the flute limit your capabilities to actually manipulate that sound with technology? And that's a question from Abigail.
Really good question, Abigail. So, yeah, so there are natural limitations to every instrument. One of the reasons why I was so interested in the flute, of course, obviously, it's my instrument, it's the best instrument. But um, one of the things about some basic synthesis methods is that they involve taking what's called a sine wave and layering those sine waves on top of each other in certain ways to create a sound. And it happens to be the case that the flute, of all the instruments, has a sound naturally that is very close to a sine wave compared to some of the other instruments. So it's sort of a natural choice for that kind of idea of additive synthesis, adding those sine waves together. Um, so that was like sort of a natural choice and a reason for that.
Got it. And now we have a question from some very curious mathematicians from North Anglia. So this question comes from the AP Calc BC class at North Broward Prep. And they're wondering, do you have friends and colleagues who play the flute as well? And do they participate in similar research as you?
Do I have friends who are flutists?
Yeah. And
Yeah,
then the second question is, are they doing the same things with the flute sounds that you're doing?
totally. Definitely lots of flute friends, lots of musician friends. But in terms of, in the research part, yeah, I think especially at MIT, all those jazz musicians that I showed are all doing different kinds of research. And, it could be related to music. I have some colleagues and friends that are doing stuff in music and AI, artificial intelligence, music and computer science, different applications, but also friends who study music and then also, are really interested in chemistry, and find ways to bring those things together.
Got it. And now I want to ask a question about some potential applications. And this question comes from Kryles. And Kryles wondering, has film influenced your music at all and has given you ideas perhaps? And Kryles is wondering specifically, have you been interested in ever creating a score for a film?
Yeah, so great timing. You'd almost think that question was a plant because I am actually working with a friend right now who's based in LA, who's a wonderful video game designer and writer, and is actually we're working on a short film together that will premiere in April, actually at MIT. And it's all about the possibility of other forms of life on other planets. So I am working on the soundtrack for that, and I'm actually it's a great question because I'm actually applying a lot of similar principles. It's all in this particular project coming from the flute and coming from these transformations of sound. But yeah, no, the film world is can be a very expansive and rich world for musical experimentation. It's one of the few worlds that I think, the general public has has regularly experienced some very experimental, contemporary, weird music through. So it's a really great avenue for this kind of experimentation.
Well, I am so excited for April and all that's coming with it. And that is just so cool. And you kind of mentioned you're collaborating with a friend on this project. That leads me to a next question from Miss Jesperson's class. And they're wondering, how has your work in general enabled you to collaborate with people in similar professions? Do you work with sound engineers? Have you worked with Foley artists?
Ooh, yeah. So collaboration is definitely a really important part of this work. And yeah, like I mentioned before, one of my favorite aspects of being a musician, not only playing with other musicians, but also working with people who do visuals and people who dance. So yeah, I haven't worked with any Foley artists, but it's definitely something I'd be interested in doing. The other day I was trying to record some wind sounds by like dragging a bag across the floor and perhaps could have used some advice from a good Foley artist. So,
Maybe that's in the cards for the future.
yes.
We have a question now from Zoe, who I think is interested in the path you're on and what it takes from an education perspective to get there. So Zoe's wondering, did you take any particular classes in high school that kind of helped you get to where you are now?
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing for me was my math classes, and not even necessarily the specific content that I was studying, but just getting into that habit and that stubbornness around problem solving was really important to me. So I would say those classes were really important. Of course, I loved being part of my band as well.
That's totally cool and I yeah, that makes total sense to me. So I'm wondering now another question about kind of the sounds you're making when you're working with other people and collaborating. Have you explored global styles of music to broaden your understanding of sounds produced by instruments or other people?
Definitely, yeah. So I started out as a, Western classically trained flute player. I was, very much playing in orchestras, and that was an amazing place to start. And as I've gotten older, I've become, obviously interested in electronic music, become very interested in jazz, and have been really lucky to have some mentors in that world as well. But yeah, there's definitely, an infinite number of styles of music. There's a different style of music for every person who's a listener. And so there will always be more to explore. And yeah, I would love to learn more about other cultures and other styles.
And in the course of your research and your work, I'm trying to imagine what a typical day looks like for you. So, and we just talked about these other sounds that could be inspiring and a starting point for a lot of work. Are you listening to music all day? Are you making music all day? What does a typical day look like for you, Jessica?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I am always listening to music, always listening to different kinds of stuff as much as possible. And sometimes when I'm making music, I try to limit my intake because I find that it's kind of like eating, or maybe that's not the best the best analogy, but it's kind of like a diet, or what you're consuming. You can't eat food or eat something at the same time as you're trying to produce something, right? So I think about trying to keep those things in balance. But in terms of the daily stuff. I'm still, taking classes and teaching classes, so that occupies a couple of hours a day. And outside of that, I always try to practice, which could involve, playing the flute, obviously, but also could involve studying a new song or a new piece of music. It could involve sitting at the computer and writing something. It could involve rehearsing. So I'm always doing that for a few good hours every day. And in my free time, I love to read. So science fiction is always really inspiring for this kinds of stuff. And I love hiking. I'm from Colorado, so love the outdoors. So always try to spend a little bit of time also just doing something outside of work.
That is so important, and I completely get it. So now we have a couple of questions related to setup. I get the sense that some of the Nord Anglia students listening in are really inspired and they want to take a stab at this. So Rohit's wondering, can you, if Rohit doesn't have the same kind of flute you have, can he make these sounds with an ordinary bamboo flute?
Ooh, that would be really cool. I would totally go for it. I personally do not have a bamboo flute, but I would be really curious to hear what that sounds like. Yeah, and I'm also happy to talk more about the like electronic tools if that would be of interest.
That was my next question, Jessica. So how can students get started with these electronic tools that you're using?
Yeah, so if you have a MacBook or an Apple computer, you already have GarageBand with it, and that is a very accessible place to start. You also don't need an Apple product to work with other kinds of software, like Audacity is really good. There's another software called Reaper that's free and does a lot of this stuff. The software that I use a lot of the time is called Ableton, and it's really cool for live looping and electronic music and different kinds of effects. But I would totally recommend just getting started with one of those free ones because they're already very powerful, and just starting there. And yeah, I remember actually how this project started was really just from me getting bored one day, putting a sound into one of those softwares, just applying a bunch of effects, kind of like that photo of my cat, just applying a bunch of effects until I was like, oh wow, this doesn't sound like a flute anymore. So it can come out of boredom sometimes.
That's totally fair. And in turn, it's also exploration, right? You didn't know what was going to happen. You didn't know what to expect. You're kind of trying these new things and then end up, being really fascinated by it. So that is really cool. And I remember using Audacity back in the day as well. So that is
Yep.
definitely fun. And you're right that it is indeed a very powerful free software. You
Yes.
briefly showed us during your presentation your setup. Could you just describe briefly for us what sort of equipment do you actually use day to day? I know we've just covered software, but like what's on your desk in front of you when you're working?
Yeah. Obviously, my computer. Um, but I also like to have a couple of speakers. So as you can actually kind of see here, this is not my regular studio, but this is a nice university studio that I can use sometimes. And I have some speakers back here. It's nice for me sometimes to have a keyboard just to get away from the flute, a piano keyboard. And to get away from the flute. And yeah, I would say those are the things. Obviously, a cup of coffee or some water.
Those are really good tools to start out with. And can you tell us so you're in a recording studio right now. What is the process of recording like? Are you practicing a lot of the pieces in advance? How do you record electronic music in a studio?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think you can sometimes get into a studio and there's like an infinite number of possibilities that you almost don't even know what to do. So it can be paralyzing. And for me, I've started to try this. I mean, I've kind of approached it in two ways. Sometimes you come into the studio and you have an idea of this is what I want to make. I'm going to try to make it. And sometimes you just really don't have that. Or you start trying to make something and you're like, oh, this is really not going the way that I wanted to. And sometimes it actually helps to just start with some material, could be a recording of your voice, and just allowing something to emerge from that. So I think for me right now, what I'm working on when I create music is trying to bring both of those mindsets together. So approaching it from that top down of I have an idea, I'm going to let that direct me, and also bottom up of I have some material and I'm going to let it tell me what it wants to do. Trying to do both those things at the same time. In terms of making an album, this particular project, it kind of took, I mean, it's every project is different. This project, I think was doing this research. I thought about it a lot, did a lot of research for probably 7 months, 8 months. And then I actually wrote the album in about 2 or 3 days. And it was just one of those things where I had done all that preparation leading up to it. And then I was like, okay, let's go, let's do it. It doesn't happen like that every time. There's also been pieces of music where I started it and it took me 2 years until I felt like, oh, this actually feels like what it was supposed to be. Or, this has come to a place of some kind of temporary completion for me. So it's always different.
So I mean, it can be a very complex process, but there's still the element of discovery within it, and that's still always a possibility, which is just so cool. So we have plenty of amazing questions. We only have time for one more, and so I want to ask this question from a Nord Anglia student who's wondering, which musicians have influenced your style and expression?
Yeah, I always love talking about my favorite musicians. Obviously, so many. My mentors, Claire Chase, Esperanza Spalding is an incredible artist and human being. Vijay Iyer, an incredible pianist. So those are some of my really important mentors. Of course, uh, there's also many musicians that I haven't met, but I would love to meet that have inspired me with their music. One of my favorite musicians right now is FKA Twigs. A very well-known producer named Sophie, who is a really big influence. Of course, Suzanne Ciani, the one that I showed in the presentation. Yeah, there's so many. So I'm always also just finding new people. You can never hear all the music that there is out there.
That is very true, but I know I plan to look up some of these artists that you've mentioned right after this as well, and I'm sure Nord Anglia students will be joining me in that effort. And I'm really excited to see everyone again next time for some really exciting abstracts later this semester. And with that, I'd like to thank the Nord Anglia Education MIT collaboration for making this series possible. Thank you very much to the students for asking such wonderful questions. I can't wait to hear the sounds that you will make in the future. I'm really looking forward to that. And I wanted to take a moment to thank again very much Jessica for sharing your music and your research with us today. I really, really learned a lot.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks so much, everyone. Go make awesome sounds.
Yes, that is great advice. Go make awesome sounds. See you all next time. Bye.